January 1944. Washington, D.C., Nebraska Avenue, in a converted school campus turned naval annex. Behind blackout curtains, the air is warmed by vacuum tubes and crowded bodies. Metal cabinets vibrate with a disciplined violence, thousands of wheels spinning, relays snapping, paper feeding through test machines. The room never truly becomes quiet. Even when the operators pause, the building seems to hum with current. A paper cup of coffee, thin, bitter, endlessly refilled, sits near a stack of punched worksheets, trembling slightly with the tremor of machinery. In another war, such a cup would be a small comfort. Here, it becomes a kind of metronome for modern battle. Not the cadence of boots, but the rhythm of electrons, probability, and time itself. This moment matters because it reveals a paradox at the heart of the Second World War, that the most decisive clashes could occur without smoke on the horizon or artillery in the distance. Yet, while convoys crossed the Atlantic and U-boats hunted in the dark, an equally lethal struggle unfolded in rooms like this, where victory depended on whether a message could be understood quickly enough to matter. In the Battle of the Atlantic, hours were not merely hours. They were ships, cargo, and lives. A delay of days could turn intelligence into history. A delay of minutes could turn a trap into a rescue. By 1944, the Allies were fighting to make secrets expire before they could do harm, and to make German orders perish at the moment of their birth. For German sailors and signal officers, Enigma was more than a machine. It was reassurance made physical, wooden case, disciplined procedure. A ritual that promised safety through complexity. The German armed forces had adopted Enigma as the principal crypto system. The Kriegsmarine, especially, treated its traffic with strict communications discipline. Yet believing that mathematics and method could build a wall no enemy could climb. The plugboard and rotating rotors did not merely scramble letters. They offered a kind of ideological comfort, that war could be controlled by order, that the correct system could guarantee security, that a well-run apparatus could defeat uncertainty. Even when setbacks came, German suspicion often turned outward, toward spies, accidents, enemy radar, not inward toward the possibility that the machine itself had been outmatched. What they expected was permanence, messages protected by astronomical possibilities, reinforced by plugboard swaps and strict daily keys. What they actually experienced, without knowing it, was a slow tightening of the net, an enemy learning to read the ocean by reading the air. Enigma traffic became, to Allied cryptanalysts, less a locked door than a rhythm, something that could be studied, anticipated, as industrialized. By 1944, in the most consequential circuits, the wall of secrecy was no longer stone. It was paper, still upright, still impressive, but already burning at the edges. To understand how such a thing could happen, it is necessary to return to the nature of Enigma itself. An electromechanical cipher machine that looked deceptively ordinary, typewriter keys and a lamp board, yet routed electrical impulses through rotors and a reflector in labyrinthine paths. At each keystroke stepped the machine forward, altering the internal wiring relationships so that encryption changed constantly even within a single message. And then came the plugboard, an additional layer, swapping paired letters before and after the rotor path, multiplying combinations beyond intuitive comprehension. The German system did not rely solely on cleverness. It relied on scale, daily procedures, key sheets, network discipline, and the belief that even if an enemy captured fragments, the whole would remain invulnerable. And yet machines do not exist alone. They are used by humans, humans with habits, routines, predictable phrases, and operational needs. Even the most complex cipher can be wounded by repetition, by the necessity of sending weather reports, by the practical constraints of naval warfare. In Codebreaking, Certainty is rarely born from genius alone, and it is often born from the intersection of enemy procedure and Allied persistence, where a probable fragment of plaintext, later called a crib, becomes a lever. The Allies could not usually break a message from scratch. They had to find the day's key. Once the key was found, messages that had seemed like indecipherable noise could be read with terrible clarity. That need, finding keys quickly enough, demanded industrial power. At Britain's Bletchley Park, bombs were built to mechanize the search for Enigma settings, speeding up the breaking of daily keys so intelligence could be acted upon. The bomb was not a magical mind. It was a brutally pragmatic machine of elimination, testing possibilities at speed, narrowing the world until only a few answers remained. It shortened the time between interception and understanding, compressing the life cycle of secrets. The work was exhausting, repetitive, and often oppressive. Operators running machines in dark, stuffy rooms through long shifts, because time itself was the being mined. In photographs of the rebuilt Turing bomb at Bletchley Park, the machine stands like an altar of synchronized motion, banks of drums, orderly complexity made visible, a physical manifestation of intellectual warfare. But even those images cannot fully convey the deeper truth, that code breaking in this era became a factory process as much as a scholarly pursuit, an assembly line of insight. Image. The naval war, however, demanded more than the usual. The Kriegsmarine used additional rotors reserved for naval traffic, increasing the combinations that bombs needed to explore. Worse, naval Enigma depended on cribs that were scarce until mid-1941. Thus Bletchley's Hut 8 faced a double burden, more rotor permutations than Army or Luftwaffe traffic, and fewer predictable openings. In the early war, even when keys could be solved, delays could be severe. But the logic of the contest was merciless. If you could not read the enemy, you had to guess his position by wreckage and absence, and by then it was often too late. Then came the sharpest blackout of all. On February 1st, 1942, the Kriegsmarine introduced a new Enigma machine configuration, M4, on the Triton cipher, known to the Allies as Shark. Bletchley Park became blind against Shark for over 10 months. For the Allies, this was not an abstract setback. It was the Atlantic growing darker, the sea lanes becoming more lethal. For Churchill and those few permitted to see the locked intelligence boxes, it meant the return of a nightmare, Britain's lifeline exposed, yet the U-boat campaign swelling precisely when German submarine strength increased. The symbolic object returns, the paper cup of coffee. In war rooms and machine rooms, coffee was not romance, it was survival, an American habit carried into the machinery of state. In these spaces, caffeine became a kind of fuel oil for democracy, not elegant, not ceremonial, but abundant enough to keep people awake for one more shift, one more calculation, one more chance to make tomorrow safer than today. Yes, the dictatorships of the Axis prized discipline and secrecy. The democracies, when cornered, learned to prize endurance, mass endurance, organized endurance, endurance sustained by logistics. Across the Atlantic, another transformation was underway, one that German signal officers did not see and could not imagine in full. The British had pioneered the assault on Enigma, but the scale of naval traffic and the increasing complexity of keys demanded an alliance not only of armies and fleets, but of production lines and engineering cultures. Early exchanges between British and American cryptologic services were cautious and strained. Information shared unevenly, progress guarded. Yet the war's pressure had a way of eroding pride. Over time, agreements formed to guarantee fuller exchange, and the American Navy began building a cryptologic industrial base of its own. Churchill's own correspondence reveals both vigilance and urgency about secrecy and sharing. Then at one point he pressed his intelligence chief with a pointed question. "Do the Americans know anything about our machine?" a reminder that intelligence cooperation was itself a strategic decision, weighed against the catastrophic cost of exposure. In Washington, the center of gravity was OP-20G, the U.S. Navy's cryptanalytic office. When the Atlantic War reached American shores with brutal immediacy, when Operation Drumbeat tore into shipping, Enigma stopped being a European problem. Yet it became an American emergency. The U.S. Navy reorganized, intensified, and recruited minds that were not shaped by naval tradition alone. Mathematicians, engineers, planners capable of thinking in circuits and throughput. Commander Joseph Wenger, Lieutenant Commander Howard Engstrom, and the engineers and operators around them began pursuing a solution that was not merely clever. It was scalable. They turned to industry, specifically to the National Cash Register Company in Dayton, Ohio, and to engineer Joseph Desch. In another era, cash registers might have symbolized peacetime commerce and American consumer life. In this war, the same industrial competence, precision parts, assembly discipline, quality control was redirected into the secret domain. Democracy's abundance, so often dismissed as softness, revealed its hidden edge, the ability to build complex machines not once, but repeatedly, reliably, in numbers. The Germans believed in perfected systems. The Americans believed, and almost instinctively, in production. The result was the U.S. Navy bomb project, centered in Building 26, and later in the Naval Communications Annex in Washington. The first bombing model 530, completed on July 4, 1943, was a monument to industrialized codebreaking. It stood roughly 8 by 7 by 2 feet, weighed about 5,000 pounds, and contained about 1,500 vacuum tubes and 11,000 wheels spinning at roughly 2,000 RPM. It cost $45,000, an enormous sum, but in naval terms, still less than the cost of a single ship's loss. The machine generated tremendous heat and noise. Operators sweltered, some developed ear problems, parts could even fly loose. This was not a romantic war of whispers. It was a war of machinery that battered the body while it saved the body elsewhere. Here, the emotional contrast sharpens. German officers envisioned their cipher clerks safely insulated behind mathematics, orders flowing outward, unbroken. The American cryptanalysts lived instead with a different reality. Secrecy so intense that even the people building the machines were compartmentalized, waves. Women, accepted for voluntary emergency services, arrived in Dayton under orders to travel out west, many with no idea of their destination. They wired, soldered, and assembled components in separate locked rooms, trained to say they were learning adding machines if questioned. Their labor was not merely supportive, it was essential, and they were part of the weapon. If Enigma was Germany's confidence, the bomb became America's collective endurance. Hundreds of hands doing boring, relentless work, sustained by routine and coffee and the knowledge that mistakes had consequences measured in ocean miles. In the Atlantic itself, the wider context in 1943 and 1944 was a turning tide, one driven by many forces: new escort tactics, improved radar, very long-range aircraft, escort carriers, weapons like hedgehog and homing torpedoes, a centralized command. Yet even in this ecosystem of change, signals intelligence mattered because it reduced the ocean's uncertainty. To reroute a convoy around a wolf pack was not to win a battle in the cinematic sense. It was to prevent one. The absence of disaster became the signature of success. The Allied struggle against Shark was never smooth. Some keys in mid-1943 could take weeks to solve. U-boat.net records that even after 4 rotor bombs entered service, some July and August Shark keys took up to 26 days. But by September 1943, Shark was generally broken within 24 hours. And by the end of 1943, the work on Shark shifted heavily to OP-20G in Washington, because the U.S. Navy had the machine capacity, over 50 bombs by mid-November. A secret war had acquired an industrial center. And then came the outcome that would have horrified German naval leadership had they known it in time. The compression of decryption delay toward the enemy's present tense. The U.S. Navy beam could test enormous volumes of possibilities at speed. Given a crib, the Model 530 could try about 20,000 letter combinations per second, testing a 4-rotor Enigma crib in about 20 minutes. By summer 1944, with around 120 American bombs running, some of the Allies were solving shark keys within half a day, and, in a phrase as chilling as any battlefield epitaph, many Enigma messages were being read at virtually the same time they were received by German clerks. Real-time in this context did not always mean instant in the modern sense. It meant operational simultaneity, that the enemy's intentions could be known while they were still intentions, not outcomes, so that U-boat positions could be inferred and acted upon while a convoy still had room to maneuver, that a message could die as a secret before it had fully lived as a plan. The German Navy had built an apparatus to command the Atlantic through hidden coordination. The Allies learned to make that coordination visible, and therefore vulnerable. The symbolic coffee cup returns again, now with heavier meaning. In those hot rooms, coffee was poured not as luxury but as a function, like oil in an engine. It was an everyday object standing in for a national capacity. Supply lines that did not collapse, agriculture that still produced, shipping that still crossed, factories that still ran. It was, in miniature, American abundance, ordinary enough to be taken for granted, yet profound when contrasted against a world of rationing and ruined ports. The German sailor might have imagined America as decadent, distracted by consumption. And yet consumption, organized, mechanized, backed by a functioning economy, proved capable of sustaining a war effort that reached into the invisible spectrum of signals and defeated a nearly unbreakable confidence with relentless continuity. For German commanders, the Enigma myth was reinforced by an important psychological fact. They never received definitive proof of compromise. Even when suspicions arose, investigations tended to find other explanations. Yet Churchill's historical account notes that Dönitz did consider Allied interception and decoding among possible causes of setbacks, yet the conclusions leaned toward espionage, accident, or coincidence, enough doubt to justify upgrades, but not enough to justify abandoning the system entirely. As a precaution, Dönitz ordered the improved M4 for U-boat communications on February 1, 1942. An act of defensive rationality that nonetheless failed to close the door forever. This is the emotional cruelty of cryptologic war. The victim often cannot feel the blade. A ship hit by a torpedo knows it is hit. A cipher system being read does not scream. It continues to function, continues to reassure its users, continues to produce messages with the comforting glow of encrypted lamps, while somewhere else, in another country's machine room, the same messages become readable ink. In the Atlantic, convoys that luckily avoided U-boat concentrations were not always lucky, that they were guided by knowledge that could not be acknowledged, even to those whose lives depended on it. And because Ultra had to be protected, intelligence itself became a performance. Decisions had to be camouflaged. When enemy suspicions were stirred by operational successes, Churchill could react with visible alarm, urging restraint unless the was thoroughly masked. The value of reading Enigma was so immense that the greatest risk was not failure to use it, but using it too cleanly, too perfectly, making the truth obvious. In this sense, the Codebreakers' victory created its own discipline, the discipline of hiding success. In Britain, the bomb story is often associated with Bletchley Park's huts and the quiet heroism of operators. The very existence of the bombs, their placement in huts like 11 and 11A, and their operation by Wrens during long shifts shows how secrecy and repetition fused into a new kind of service. Yet their impact extended across land, sea, and air campaigns, accelerating the breaking of daily keys, enabling intelligence to arrive in time to influence action rather than merely explain tragedy. At the National Museum of Computing, the reconstructed bomb is presented not merely as artifact, but as turning point, an early milestone on the road to the digital world. It existed to discover the daily key so that thousands of intercepted messages could be deciphered. With some keys could be broken in 2 to 4 hours, some never. Speed always essential. That phrasing, speed always essential, captures the war's deeper truth, that information in war has a half-life. What mattered was not only cracking Enigma, but cracking it in time. In the American story, speed became industrial doctrine. The naval annex in Washington grew into a machine room nation within a nation. Operators sweating under the heat of bombs, maintenance teams chasing failures, analysts feeding the machines with cribs and then chasing jackpots, the correct daily keys that unlocked torrents of traffic. The Allies feared constantly that Germany might discover Enigma's vulnerability. Yet, as the U.S. naval history account emphasizes, the Germans never truly did, often attributing Allied success to coincidence or to other technologies like radar. The cipher that was supposed to protect a global submarine campaign remained until late war, an instrument that betrayed it. Now the title's promise comes into focus. Germans horrified by the idea of American codebreakers reading Enigma in real time. The horror, when it finally surfaced after the war through documents and interrogations, was not simply that the system had been penetrated. It was that the penetration had been scaled, that it had become routine, clock-like, repeatable, that the enemy could do it not once, not as a miracle, but as process. As that secrecy, so central to operational confidence, had been converted into a kind of mirrored battlefield where German decisions cast shadows the Allies could measure. And with that realization would come a transformation of perception. The war had not been lost only by torpedoes avoided or U-boats sunk, but by an unseen failure of ideology. The Axis faith in controlled systems, perfect procedures, centralized command, secrecy as armor, met a democratic counterforce that looked, at first glance, as too open and too noisy to be dangerous. Yet openness did not prevent organization. Noise did not prevent discipline. Democracy's advantage lay partly in its ability to mobilize diverse minds, to hand critical work to young women in uniform and doctoral mathematicians and factory engineers, to turn a commercial cash register company into an arsenal of cryptanalysis, to fill endless paper cups of coffee because the supply chain still functioned. Yet even the physical character of the bomb speaks to this transformation. The machine was loud, hot, imperfect, prone to failures, requiring constant maintenance. It was not the pristine precision of propaganda. It was the ungainly power of a society capable of absorbing inefficiency and correcting it through numbers, training, spare parts, and perseverance. Just the German imagined advantage, technical sophistication guarded by discipline, encountered an American form of sophistication that was different, modular, repeatable, supported by industrial depth. The coffee cup on the desk is not merely beverage, it is emblem of an economy that can afford to keep people awake at scale, night after night, while building machines that spin at 2,000 revolutions per minute and never stop asking the same question: what did the enemy just say? And so, across 1944, the Atlantic becomes not only a sea war, but a timing war. A U-boat commander might send a sighting report, trusting that the message would vanish into ciphered darkness. Yet the very need to send reports, short, structured, predictable, could become the rib bones of a crib. Once the key was found, orders and positions could be pieced together, and the ocean's seeming randomness could be reduced. Convoys could be rerouted, hunters could be sent, Supply U-boats could be targeted, and applying multiplier effects by removing the submarines that replenished other submarines at sea. The U-boat arm, so feared for its invisibility, found its invisibility compromised by the invisibility of the codebreakers who were reading its breath. In a war saturated with symbols, flags raised, cities bombed, speeches broadcast, there is something sobering about the quietest symbol of all. A locked box of papers, a stack of decrypts, a buff-colored container that only one man might open. And Churchill's account recalls that Enigma-derived material came in locked buff boxes to which he alone held the key, even from his private office. Secrecy was treated as oxygen, shared only as needed because too many lungs would consume it. The entire enterprise depended on silence, not merely the silence of operators forbidden to speak, but the silence of commanders forced to act without explaining why. There is, in that silence, a final irony that frames the epilogue. Yet dictatorships often imagine themselves as masters of secrecy, and democracies as vulnerable because they cannot fully control information. Yet here, the democracies built a secret so deep that even their own participants often knew only fragments. The secret was protected not by terror alone, but by compartment, procedure, and shared belief in necessity. Yet the men and women in those machine rooms were not coerced into silence by ideology's threat, so much as bound into silence by ideology's purpose, the protection of lives, the continuity of supply, the survival of a free society under siege. When the war ended, much of the physical machinery was dismantled, destroyed, or discarded, because secrecy did not end with victory. The visible monuments were erased. The work receded into archives and memories that could not be shared for decades. But what remained, often, was only the knowledge that the war had been fought in more dimensions than most citizens could imagine. A single silent bomb on display could become, years later, a rare, tangible monument to an invisible victory. The paper cup of coffee sits again, in memory, on a desk beneath humming lights. It represents nothing glorious by itself. No medal, no banner. Yet it symbolizes a kind of abundance that proved strategically decisive. The abundance of energy, of time, yes, of trained hands, of spare parts, of paper, of electricity, of factories that could build not only ships and planes, but also the machinery of understanding. In the code-breaking rooms, democracy did not announce itself with speeches. It expressed itself through continuity, the ability to keep working, keep producing, keep thinking, keep listening. And perhaps that is the larger truth that lingers after the last decrypt fades into the archive. When tyranny seeks to make the world legible only to itself, commands flowing one way, secrets sealed, obedience enforced. But freedom, when threatened, can become legible to reality in a deeper sense. It can marshal openness into strength, commerce into production, ordinary lives into extraordinary concentration. It can turn a civilian engineer's workshop into a battlefield, turn a young operator's night shift into a convoy's survival, turn bitter coffee into an emblem of endurance. In the end, yet the Germans did not hear the moment their Enigma messages became readable in near real time. There was no explosion, no siren, only the steady clatter of machines, the turning of drums, the quiet accumulation of certainty. The war's loudest sea could be mastered by the war's quietest rooms. And in those rooms, amid heat and noise and sleepless repetition, and a simple cup, refilled again and again, marked the strange victory of abundance harnessed to purpose, the victory of a society that could afford, even in total war, to keep its people awake long enough to understand the enemy before the enemy could act.